Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm Mickey Huff with Eleanor Goldfield. Today on the program, we are unveiling a 10-part special series that is a partnership between Project Censored and investigative journalist Peter Byrne. It's titled Military AI Watch: The Dangerous Militarization of AI and the Profiteering Behind It. Project Censored and award-winning investigative journalist Peter Byrne present a groundbreaking 10-part expose on the dangerous militarization of artificial intelligence and the profiteering that drives it. Byrne, known for his deep investigations into the intersection of science, industry, and government, uncovers how Silicon Valley and the Department of Defense and banking sector, corporate media, scientific institutions are all collaborating to develop AI for military use. While corporate media touts AI's potential with glowing narratives, the public remains largely unaware of its growing role in warfare and surveillance. This series exposes the hidden forces behind the AI arms race, the corporations cashing in, and the dire consequences for global security and democracy. Based on 2 years of extensive research, Byrne's reporting sheds light on what powerful interests don't want you to know. Hence, we are being here on the Project Censored Show. The first article is out now at projectcensored.org. One ring to rule them all. Silicon Valley's plan to conquer the world with AI weapons. Can we do anything about it? Peter Byrne, welcome back to the Project Censored Show.
Hi, Mickey. Good to see you again.
It is great to have you back on the program, and we are delighted to be working with you in concert on this extraordinary series, and a very timely one at that, given the expansion of technology through warfare. But again, reading through your launching piece, your inaugural piece for the series, 7,500 word piece that really dives into the deep end. And there's a lot in this piece, Peter Byrne, that I'm assuming that even folks that quote unquote pay attention to news, foreign policy, military industrial complex issues may simply not know. Peter Byrne, let's talk about the genesis of the series and tell our listeners a little bit about it.
You know, I was thinking this morning about how the United States economy exported all these manufacturing jobs, leading somewhat to the situation that we find ourselves in now. But what they didn't export was weapons manufacturing. That's a huge industry in the United States. And, you know, it reminded me also of, I don't know if you remember The House of Krupp by William Manchester, which was about how the arms industry in Nazi Germany, in combination with the banking industry and investors, drove, their puppet Hitler into war. I think that a lot of that's going on now. We have a confluence of profit seeking, extreme profit seeking, in a situation where it's very difficult for the investors that have put tens and tens of billions of dollars into AI weaponry to make money, because one, it's really hard to design and manufacture these instruments of war. Two, the market is limited to governments. So what we see is investors pouring a lot of operating capital in to get these things off the ground, because they want to put in $10 and then sell it for 10 million for to make a startup profit. But they're not getting there because, first of all, they need hot wars to advance their scientific research, which they do have in the Ukraine and in Gaza, and they are using that as a laboratory. But the infrastructure to make these weapons isn't just making a weapon, it's data centers, which I'm going to be talking about or writing about next issue. It's this vast infrastructure that you need, including compliant populace, to make it possible to funnel huge portions of the national wealth into the creation of death machines. So at the top of this is, Peter Thiel, who famously, and we talk about this in the beginning of the article, names all his companies after objects in the Lord of the Rings, because the Lord of the Rings has a fascination for investing militarists like Peter Thiel, because it's Manichaean. It is complete either you're evil or either you're good. Either you're a nice middle class hobbit or you're an evil communist Bolshevik, which is what they, Tolkien was painting Soren as. On the other hand, when Peter Thiel names his company Palantir 20 some odd years ago, which is, is the espionage company they set up with his own $30 million and a couple million from the CIA's InQtel, he was actually not identifying with Frodo. He was identifying with Thorin. It's very clear. And that continues. You know, Peter Thiel's kind of a dark lord here. He's James David Vance is his apprentice and protege, and the turnaround in Trump from declaring that crypto was a house of cards to where we see hit the entire Trump family now profiting off of crypto. It's very much tied into the development of these data centers, which are essential not just for crypto, but for the military AI war machine. So, this is a problem that has been going on in various iterations, obviously, for several hundred years here in America, where we're an extremely militarist entity. We're a colonial entity. We're a settler colonial entity. We're an imperialist entity. And we've kind of, due to the export of all sorts of staple types of manufacturing and agriculture, we're now importing apparently more food than we're exporting, which is really weird considering the fecundity of the American heartland. But not so weird when considering how it's been monopolized. So, this is a function where the increasing concentration of capital and brings about these monopolies that destroy productivity. The monopolies in agriculture, our Cargill and the rest of them, are destroying the productivity of American agriculture, and the increasing monopolization in the weapons industry is oddly enough also kind of destroying that at the same time it's promoting that. I mean, if you look at the so-called military industrial complex, which the General Accounting Office and people and the bureaucrats like now call Defense Industrial Base, although that's a bit of a euphemism because it's not really defense, it's offense. It's gone from like 55 or so companies, corporations post World War II down to 5 primes right now.
Yeah, and those are called primes. You write that in the piece.
They are. And they, Lockheed Martin gets more government money than any other entity outside of like Social Security. And, Northrop and Boeing and the rest of them are just vast leeches on the American public. But they're being like harassed by this yipping little dog of military AI companies, run by corporations that do not need to manufacture nuclear weapons and bombs and submarines and stuff like that. All they need to do is manufacture. All they need to do actually do is design chips.
So it's a well-heeled yipping dog.
Very well-heeled, because, venture capital, which is driving this, they don't care so much about product. What they do is they'll throw, hundreds of millions of dollars at, 50 or 60 different startups, and if one of them sticks, they're happy, right? Well, the Palantir, which is started by Thiel, and Anduril, which is financed by Thiel largely and created by Thiel largely, are two of the startups that stuck. And it's stuck because they're very good at getting Department of Defense or Department of Offense or Department of War. I don't know why they ever renamed it. It is the Department of War contracts. And they monetize those contracts to convince investors to give them ever more money. So it's kind of a Ponzi scheme because, Palantir wasn't making much money when it was started in 2003. And its contracts generally were with the CIA, which was one of its funders, and ICE, or the progenitor of ICE. They were classified, so we don't know what they were very much, but they were all about surveilling the population and feeding into law enforcement. They famously had a big contract with the Los Angeles Police Department to do predictive policing, which, that didn't work at all. So they way that they monetize themselves was by luring investors like Andreessen Horowitz and all these big ones to put in literally hundreds of millions of dollars predicated on two things: one, the advancing technology, and two, that there would be wars to use the technology on, because what use is making the technology if you don't have a war? So consequently, you see people like Thiel and Andreessen and Alexander Karp, his little puppet, and Vance and others. They're always shouting about, China's the evil empire. It's like, we have to march east now and seize the ring from China. They've got the AI ring and we need it. Well, actually, we've got the AI ring. China's like coming along, but it's nowhere near to have the kind of industrial and design and capacity the United States still has. So along the way, Palantir, which is very good at lobbying, spends a lot of money on lobbying and gaming the political system through elected officials, doesn't pay any taxes. It appears that it's never paid a federal income tax. It was privately owned by Thiel and Company until 2020 when it went public. So after that, it has to file annual reports to the SEC, and none of those reports show that they've ever paid any federal income tax. They've paid a little bit of state income tax and some foreign income tax, but they've managed to sequester like about $5.2 billion in profits, which they are then redistributing to their owners and board members. Your ordinary stockholder in Palantir, the poor suckers, aren't going to get a dividend. And even though the stock goes up and down, depending on the political situation, they are completely dependent upon selling at the right moment to make any kind of profit. And so what happened was, after Trump's election, the stock went up, and all the owners and the board members immediately used the $5.2 billion, or a portion of it, to repurchase stocks and stock options that they had, thereby driving. It was a pump and dump. So then the stock price collapsed, and all your mom and dad investors, if there is mom and dad investors in this, mostly it's like hedge funds and stuff like that, are sitting there holding stock that is increasingly worthless because their product is destruction. Their product is not production. Their product is based on fear and anger and illusion and delusion.
So, Peter Byrne, I just want to jump in quickly there because you mentioned just a series of names. Some of them people know, some of them maybe our listeners don't. And of course, this also involves the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, who managed to give a great review of Alex Karp's book, and in the just to look at what the web of these people happen to be, right? Elon Musk is in part of this group with SpaceX, of course. Time magazine also published, as you wrote, a glossy spread on Karp and Palantir's role in running a lethal network of weaponized drones. This is like a confluence of not just the military industrial complex or a surveillance industrial complex or the Silicon Valley war machine. It's also, of course, social media, legacy media, and how they all reinforce these. They reinforce each other and their agendas. And I just wanted to read a quick passage that you wrote, because you just mentioned that these people are not making things, they're destroying things. They're making things for destruction. You mentioned a quote from Karp that he says, quote, "The way you dominate the future is you dominate the present." Harsh Orwellian terms as far as that goes. Karp says, "I want America to be American in 1,000 years." Oh, some Reich talk there. Americans are the most loving, God-fearing, least discriminatory people on the planet. If you're waking up and thinking about harming American citizens, or if you are a foreign power sending fentanyl to poison our people, something really bad is going to happen to you and your friends and your bank account and your mistress. I mean, were it not for who this person is and what they're doing, do they not sound like a raving lunatic to you?
Well, 6 months ago, Alexander Karp, who's the CEO of Palantir and has been in Thiel's little puppet for 20 some odd years, was fervently supporting Kamala Harris.
Interesting.
And now he's switched to this. But he's been one of the biggest voices for war. He wants to go to war with China. He wants to destroy China's industrial base. At least that's what he says. The guy, if you look at him, he's got this like wiry hair, and he's studied with some Frankfurt School people back in grad school. So he calls himself a
Sure.
progressive. He's one of the most reactionary individuals that's ever come along in American history, you know. And this new book he wrote, I forget his title, technological something or other. It's supposedly it's a bestseller, although who knows?
Right.
I mean, Thiel might have bought 1 million copies, but you know,
The
the book is,
Technological Republic. Yeah.
I didn't actually read much of the book, but if you look at the video, I posted it in a link in the story where he promotes it. That's where that quote comes from,
Yeah.
you know, and what they're trying to do is to instill fear and hatred and reward of greed into the populace. I mean, Eric Schmidt and Kissinger did the same thing a couple of years ago. They wrote a book called The Age of AI, where they basically are saying the same thing that Karp is saying now. We're losing their race and military AI to China, and we need to crush them before they crush us. You know, the New York Times has an interesting article today. It's not my favorite newspaper, but occasionally it comes across a kernel of truth about China. You know, its economy tanked a few years ago because of overinvestment in real estate, which is similar to what happens here, right? Because it's a capitalist country. It's not communist or even socialist. And now their industrial base is huge because it's focused on export of electric cars and actually items that are better than just this plastic crap that they used to like find everywhere in your Walgreens. Um, and unfortunately, when you get into situations where these huge entities are engaged in trade wars, it usually leads to a hot war. I mean, World War I, World War II, you know, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. These were not ideological wars. These were wars of economic entities against each other. I mean, the Ukraine is a proxy war between the United States and the capitalist Russia, right? Um, so the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, who is also the owner of Amazon Web Services, which is the largest one of the largest military contractors because of its cloud services, um, does this review of Karp's book, which is like hagiographical. It's the greatest thing that ever came along.
Yeah.
He's so sharp, and you know, it's like the Washington Post. I have to say, to digress for a moment, you know, it never was this like wonderful institution as people paint it to be. I mean,
Right.
was a naval intelligence spy, right? But we're not go down that rabbit hole for the moment. But you know, Bezos has some of the largest war contracts in existence, and who's his competitor? Well, Musk, right?
Yeah.
I mean, with SpaceX and Blue Origin, they're both competing for domination of military satellites, and he's a competitor with Microsoft. Microsoft is like one of the most warlike entities that has come along in human history. I mean, Bill Gates is not a philanthropist. Everything his foundation touches crumbles. Healthcare in Africa or things like that, the educational system. The man's a cancer on society, you know. Uh, and Microsoft is one of the largest monopolies that's ever come along. It was broken up a little bit in the 1990s by the Department of Justice, which sued it on antitrust issues. But then it came back, and it is really owns OpenAI. I mean, to call OpenAI something separate from Microsoft is a delusion. And it's got multiple contracts with Anduril and Palantir. So, but Amazon Web Services also has multiple contracts with Palantir and Anduril. So we have an interesting situation where these really large behemoth, you know, tech companies are allied with large behemoth military companies, and then you've got Anduril and Palantir who have like the tech that can possibly cheapen the manufacture of the means of war, coming along and allying with both of them, or all five of them, or whatever, back and forth. These shifting alliances where they gain market share by dominating the technology and patenting the technology. They get funded by these huge behemoths. They get funded by venture capitalists. They get funded by the Department of War, and then they have to produce products. And what do they produce? They produce things like Gospel and Lavender and Where's Daddy, which is like killing children in Gaza.
Right. So, well, Peter, you also bring in Salesforce's Mark Benioff, who also owns Time, and they, of course, also gave rave reviews to Carp. And of course, they're also involved in military AI. They're
But,
also
it
financed by
gets worse
CIA.
than that, Mickey. You've got all these like AI washing nonprofits walking around, like dozens of them, and they'll have these conferences in Europe on how to regulate AI. And who's their featured speaker? Carp
Yeah.
or Schmidt.
Yeah. Yeah.
And all these nonprofits, they bow down to these like world-class monsters as if working with them is somehow going to show them the light. Well, maybe we should regulate AI so that you make a little bit less money and we don't all die, And then they start talking about super intelligence, stuff like that. Well, I would actually have to say, when people talk about the singularity, when machines are going to start dominating people, it's over. It's done. It's already happened, right?
Yeah.
The
Right.
singularity is in the past. It's not to come. Worse is to come.
Well,
But, we're a human machine entity now, dedicated and focused on destruction, not on production.
so we're talking to investigative journalist and science writer Peter Byrne. Peter Byrne has partnered with Project Censored to do a 10-part series titled Military AI Watch, the dangerous militarization of AI and the profiteering behind it. We're talking about the very first installment, One Ring to Rule Them All. And Peter, before the break, we left off with some sobering points about who we're dealing with and what we're dealing with. But you also, in your inaugural piece, talk about really the inadequacy of AI technology or military AI machine trainers, that actually some of the things that they're making or providing actually won't do so well, maybe out on the field, or actually are not really, as far as quote, smart weapons and this kind of, euphemistic language goes. They're actually an unmitigated disaster that might, turn over to AI, what ultimately leads to the destruction of the planet. Peter Byrne.
Well, famously, as Princeton scholars said, is AI snake oil. I mean, the holy grail or whatever of the industry is what they call the Joint Awareness Domain Command and Control System, the JDAC. And this is a pie in the sky conception in which the entire globe is considered as a battle space, and it's monitored by submarines, by those sail drone kind of surfboards with AI on them that are constantly floating around the ocean. It's a whole nother story. Interesting. And hundreds of thousands of sensors are supposed to like create a picture of the entire battle space in which a centralized control person, or possibly an AI, or a person assisted by AI, or an AI assisted by a person, will then be able to make decisions, lethal decisions on tactics and also strategies in what is a global system of military destruction. Um, this whole thing at the current level has several huge flaws. One, it depends on devices that can use radio waves to transmit their surveillance information back to central nodes. And those are seriously easy to jam. I mean, getting the message past a jamming signal is almost impossible. So it's like the anti-ballistic missile shield. I mean, they gave up on Star Wars long ago because you can shoot enough missiles that you can't shoot them all down. It's the same thing with jamming. So what they've done is they're trying to program AIs to make decisions on their own where they won't have to be linked into the global positioning system or other methods of transmitting radio signals. which means that, yeah, they'll go, if they're an Anduril drone that's flying into a war zone, he gets to decide who to kill and when to kill, but the jamming thing is pretty much an end game to the concept of being able to have a global military picture of a battle space that can be controlled. But that's not stopping the government in these military corporations from pretending that they can make such a thing. L3 Harris, Microsoft, all the rest of them. If you go to their websites, they've pretty much all got their versions of these controllable battle space systems up with the groovy little videos showing people like with multiple screens being able to figure out the best way to defeat their enemies. And so you've got all these corporations have different versions of it, and then you've got the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. They all have their own different versions of it too, and they're all stovepiped and they don't talk to one another. So this concept that somehow they're going to link together this incredible battle space picture is impossible, because even if the Army and the Navy and the Air Force build out their battle management systems, their AI controlled battle management systems, they won't be talking to one another. So the Navy won't know what the Air Force is doing and vice versa. I mean, it sounds crazy, but it is really that stupid. And that's the way that the military industry has always worked. I mean, the allocation of funds for building weapons is based on congressional districts and it's just slices of the pie. And each of the services has not only their own contractors, they have their own think tanks, like the Air Force has RAND and stuff like that, which gives them ideological and political, scientific justifications to do what they're going to do anyway, which is to make enough weapons to kill us all. Sorry, I digress. What was the question?
Oh, so well, look, these are all important things to point out. You talk about, you're talking about a handful of these companies, and a lot of these people are interlocking in so many ways. You talk about AI antitrust solutions harkening back to the Rockefeller days and Standard Oil. And you mentioned earlier that we're down to about 5 companies that, not just in the primes, as you called them, but in the tech sector. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, I'm sure this isn't something that's on the horizon in terms of Congress investigating, but using this as a tool of analysis, how could antitrust work? How could that work here? Going back
on the one hand, the American government had to step on Standard Oil and JP Morgan and the rest of the robber barons back in the turn of the last century, prior.
Yeah.
Because they were ruining the American economy. They were causing recessions. They were, causing trade wars. All sorts of bad things were happening. So they stepped on them and broke them up a little bit, I referred in my article to a really famous paper published by Lena Khan, who was Biden's head of the Federal Trade Commission, in, I think, 2017 in the Yale Law Journal. It was the Amazon Paradox. And it was a great expose or exposition of antitrust law and the history of antitrust law in the United States, and not just federal, but at the state level. And also, it applies to Europe. I mean, all these so-called Western countries have antitrust laws. And basically what I was saying was that if you wait to break up these companies until they're too big, like Microsoft, you're not going to be able to do it because they're too powerful. So you got to nip them in the bud. So this is what got me interested in taking this approach to the first article in the series, was just to look at this developing monopoly, because when I saw the announcement in December that Anduril and Palantir were making this consortium that included, SpaceX and OpenAI and Microsoft and a bunch of others, that's a classic antitrust issue, because that basically says they're squashing competition. They're using market power to make it impossible for competitors to arise, not to mention get contracts. Palantir has inaugurated this thing called FedStart. It sells its political clout to anybody that wants to give it $1 million a year, where it will accelerate your military contracts and getting through your classification loopholes and things like that. So you've got to basically now, if you want a military contract in the AI field, you've got to go through Palantir, which of course is going to leverage and monetize that knowledge. So it's a big, I call it a cluster bucks in the article, but we know what I mean, right?
Yes, we do. Peter Byrne, we only have a couple minutes left in the segment, and you end this first installment by going back to a 1991 book by Manuel DeLanda called War in the Age of Intelligent Machines. And you have an interesting quote: military institutions have mutated out of all proportion in this century. And DeLanda was talking about the 20th century. It is impossible to tell where the civilian sector begins and where the military ends. Peter Byrne.
Well, that's the problem, right? I mean, Dwight Eisenhower was no socialist, but he gave us the famous warnings, and it's worth reading his entire speech or listening to it, because what he was talking about has absolutely
The farewell,
transpired.
farewell address from 1961, the infamous.
Military industrial complex, but
That
he
is
also
right.
said academic and scientific. We forget about that. And
Yes.
I also link towards the end of this article with one a paper by Elke Schwartz, who's a scholar in England, has done a very nice analysis of how capital flows and military connections are ruining the American and Western economies through just the same old time monopoly practices. But also to Achilles Mbembe's, who's an African-based philosopher, concept of necropolitics, which is a play off of Foucault's biopolitics, where in Foucault's biopolitics, the state controls the means of life, and necropolitics, the state controls the means of death.
Yes.
Where we're at. We're not talking about life here. We're talking about death. And that's why if we look for nonprofits, for the most part, not all, but most, and we look for industry to solve this, it will never happen. It's got to be a grassroots uprising, and something far beyond what we saw this weekend with, people out there going, hands off of NATO, don't talk about Gaza. No, it's got to be hundreds of thousands of people in the street saying, hey, we don't want to end up like Gaza.
Yeah.
Because these people will push the working class in America into Gaza situations. They want them back, slaving away at subminimal wages is what they want. And so put down their screens. That's what people got to do. Put down your screens.
So, Peter Byrne, this is a 10-part series, Military AI Watch at projectcensored.org. People can learn more at peterbyrne.info. In the series, the first is One Ring to rule them all. We also have the Stargate fiasco, war games, the capture of the Federation of American Scientists, the frightening world of human-machine teaming experiments, billions for doomed to fail AI projects, the role of AI washing nonprofits, oligarchs, tax cheats, stock market gaming, conflicts of interest, AI joint ventures. There is so much that you are going to delve into through the end of the year. Peter Byrne, national and international award-winning investigative reporter and science writer, thank you for your incredibly important investigative work and joining us on the Project Censored Show. Any last words or places where you want people to follow you or maybe contact you about this important work? And I'd love to see more and more outlets and people interviewing you and getting this information out there.
Well, my website's, you can Google it, Peter Byrne, BYRNE.info. And his contact information is there. I'm happy to hear from anybody with tips or reactions. And I don't want to be a total pessimist about this. I think these people are going to fail. They do these monstrous things and it fails and then they regroup. And, in this country, they gave people some social services and now they're having a counter revolution to take them away. Right. But it's going to fail because most people are good. And it's, in my view, the scum rises to the top.
Peter Byrne, it was wonderful to speak with you today. We'll be having you back on the program for updates on each of the installments moving forward. So thanks so much for joining us on the Project Censored Show today.
Thanks for having me.